This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. It's Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley, Respectonomics, and we're talking today, it's like phase 2 of our 3-part series on relationships. The last episode, as you know, was on the relationships corporately. This time we're going to be talking about corporate relationships in the political orbit. And I have with me my co-host, Sarah. And I know Sarah has political opinions, which I think we will be hearing about. I have political opinions. And the only reason that matters at all is because everybody does. So the context of having respect and dignity within the political field is extremely important in terms of our day-to-day living and our expectations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for having me, Jeremy. So welcome to episode 2 of our 3-part series, as Jeremy mentioned, and it is titled Impolite Politics. So today we're examining politics through the lens of relationships between leaders, parties, and the public, in a time when divisions run very deep, and how can we rebuild trust and foster respect within these complex dynamics? We'll explore what politics means today and whether Respectonomics can reshape relationships in this realm, and how Respectonomics might heal these fractures. And lastly, we're going to look at discussing how managing expectations is key to sustaining healthier political relationships.
Well, that sounds very reasonable, and I'd like to mention that I've got all the answers.
I'm confident that
every single one. Now, whether they're right or not is moot.
Well, if they're right to you, then that's what matters. Isn't that respecting everybody's opinions?
Well, it respects me. That's very good.
Exactly.
Nothing wrong with that.
So, in terms of Respectonomics, how does Respectonomics define relationships in politics? And what do you mean by impolite politics?
Well, the impoliteness is to do the way that the politics have become, and I'm using that word politics as a generic term for when we talk about government and all that sort of stuff. And I'm being very generic because one of the problems with politics today is that expression has become very loosely defined in itself. Most people, they just mumble the word politics. Somehow it gets to government, somehow it gets to parliament, sometimes it gets to Congress. It goes all over the place. There's very little sense of real definition behind the scenes. So to answer your question about how does Respectonomics come to grips with politics generally, I think the first thing you have to do is to go back to the origin of politics. I find out this is a key point to Respectonomics, is that we keep going back, the sort of stripping back the onion skin and going back to the core issues. And the core issue is this. Politics is from the Greek polis, meaning a city. And the Athenians invented this whole thing around the concept of democracy. And the polis was the city, but it was a city-state. And that's an important distinction because what it meant was everybody in that community had a say in how the arrangements would work. I think one of the problems in politics, impolite politics today, is how many of us feel included? I think the answer is not many of us. You said in your opening comments about trust and confidence and so on. Well, when you're excluded, it doesn't take long to get to that. But the other thing that's interesting about this Greek polis is not only did it mean city, but the plural of polis is polites. I want you to look very, very interested in that.
I am.
Greek. But no, polites is the plural of polis, and it means citizens. So the key point that the political arrangement that the Athenian democracy revolved around was the city-state and the citizenry, the people who actually were there. In other words, who was in charge of the democratic arrangement? It was the people.
Right.
I would say to you, that's a part that's been lost significantly.
No, I would agree with you there. And perhaps one of the very many reasons, in complete honesty, that I can almost disassociate from politics. I don't enjoy politics.
And if you think about that for a second, that is, I don't want to use the word inappropriate, but
Mhm.
it's inconsistent with your talents, your humanity, your experience, your family life, and so on. I mean, you
Mhm.
should have the whole concept of your political arrangement or surroundings should be one that actually makes you enthusiastic. It should be
Absolutely.
one that sort of says, "Hey, I can do it." So
Right.
I think the first thing we need to come to grips with is I think there are two railway tracks here. Where respectonomics comes into play is to respect the dignity of the other human being, number one. We've talked about that many a time. But what I'm noticing is, or observing is, in this political arena, how often do you see us being disrespected? Your opinions, your relevance to the community, and so
Mhm.
on. It's almost like you're being treated as an automaton.
And I think that's what's resulted in a lot of Canadians, because we're in Canada, um, disassociating from politics or engaging in it. They don't believe in it. They don't feel part of it.
That is
Right.
correct. And I think the other thing where respectonomics comes into play is when we say to be part of it. Remember, when people say to us, well, what's the business of respectonomics? The business is to honor other people's freedom of choice.
Right.
And that again is something that's being suffocated. So I
Yeah.
think the railway tracks we need to look at are twofold. And I want your opinion on this one, because I know you love politics, but I want your opinion on two things, or your engagement on these 2 points. Number
Right.
one, we need to talk about the individual. If somebody is standing for parliament or standing for senate or standing for council, whatever it is, we need to talk about the individual and how that individual could be framed by respectonomics. Number one.
Mhm.
Number two, this may sound like it's out of our orbit, but we also need to talk about the structure of how that council or whatever the organization is, parliament, how it's in fact organized. Because you see, the problem is, and none of us really wants to admit this, but the average human being is averagely very tribal. And that means we want to belong to a tribe. We
Mhm.
either choose to be a leader or we want to be a follower. So far, so good. The
Right.
trouble is, it's a process that's very accessible to corruption and coercion and abuse. That's the human, what would you call it? The human, I don't know. It's what
I think that's
who
just
we are.
I think it's how it's modeled. I mean, we see it not just in our country, but in other
Ah,
countries. And when you think about a leader and having followers, as
mm,
you say, it's understanding what does that leader represent and what are they saying or what are their behaviors in order to attract or gain engagement from followers. And I
mm.
think that's a lot of where the key comes in is what are you presenting? What do you stand for? And then what do you follow through on after once you get those followers?
Well,
If you,
I think the example that makes more sense than any. Let's deal with the individual first, and then come through to the structures.
mm,
But if we
yes,
deal with the individual, the snag is that if you want to be the leader of your tribe, that leader, more than anything, needs to be somebody who wants to serve the tribe. We've
yeah,
lost a lot of leadership. I mean, in my opinion, leadership is the power to serve. And if you think of some of the greatest leaders you can think of, I mean, my mind goes easily to Winston Churchill, for example.
hmm,
You might say Diefenbaker, you might say Roosevelt. But if you think about it, those individuals, if you hardly even know what party they stood for.
right.
What you do know is they were leaders, you knew that, but they were also people who served. They believed in serving.
And I think that's a lot of the challenges that we're faced with today when you're taking it back to going with that train of thought on that track in terms of it being the individual is it's serving. I find today it's more about what power does that give
Ah,
me as an individual versus What does it give me? What does it allow me to do? How
Yeah.
does it make me feel
Mm.
over you versus how am I then serving to the greater
Mhm.
population?
Our listeners our audience needs to know one thing, that we have a subsequent episode coming up, the title of which is What's in It for Me?
Mm-hmm.
And that is, in fact, we're now talking in an isolated case where you've
Right.
got leadership in a political context. It does rest a lot on what's in it for me.
Right.
I was told once that there's only one clarion call for every prime minister, and I think it probably applies to presidents and all the other
Right.
autocracies. But I was told that the name of the game is to win the next election.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's like a gladiator fight saying, I have to win. And you're watching this gladiator fight. And here's the problem. You watch the gladiator fight, one slays the other, which I don't
Mm-hmm.
think is a very good way of building your community, number one. And number two, the person who wins the gladiatorial fight gets to be the leader. Well, they're two different camps. If
It's
you want
funny.
to
And I
go,
was thinking the same thing in terms of, like you say, the gladiator approach. It's what tactics are you using when you are challenging each other? So are you slinging personal things that may not be relevant to what it is that you're actually going to stand for in serving your community or your country or your province,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
I don't
So,
know.
but and I think the biggest difficulty we're going to have is I think we can identify the context, if you will, or the what a leader should look like, this
Mm,
serving and so on. We can talk about the structures that would be probably more suitable to bring this together. I think the greatest difficulty we have, and it's almost, in fact, it is outside of the orbit of respectonomics, is how do we get that in place?
right.
But I think all of us would agree very quickly that leadership today has become abusive. It's become probably corrupt. I think it's parasitical because I think it feeds on the actual host.
Right.
It's not a pleasant dilemma. And I think
Hmm.
the other thing is when you said, for example, at the beginning, I don't really like talking about politics. That I think is a way of looking at something that's fundamentally toxic. If
Right.
something is unpleasant and is going to give you some kind of, disease or leprosy or something, you're more likely to avoid it.
Correct.
And
It's just not an enjoyable topic.
no, I must tell you one other thing. You know how you love your Greek history.
I love my Greek history.
Okay, do you want one more?
I'm
One
ready for my lesson.
last one of the day. But
Okay.
it was interesting when the Greek Athenians were having their meeting, they would call the ecclesia. The ecclesia, in fact, it's where the word ecclesiastical comes from. But what it meant was ek, out of, ecclesia, to be called. You were called out of what you were doing to go to the meeting.
Okay.
Fine. And so if you were the baker, for example, you'd put take the loaves out of the oven and go off to the meeting. Well, you can imagine there were plenty of people who were or baking their loaves, and they didn't actually want to go to the meeting. You ever had that feeling that you didn't want
Sounds
to?
familiar.
Yeah. And those people were called idiotes, which meant
Mm,
they were the ones that stood still. And that's where we get the word idiot from. And the problem with
interesting.
that arrangement is, although that sounds a little bit sort of almost like a giggle, the
Yes.
problem is, have you ever had that feeling that in that political domain, you and I are being treated as idiots?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think there's a double meaning to that. Not only are we set aside, but it's
Right.
also consideration. And there again, under the heading of respectonomics and bringing dignity to the human being, in our case to the voting population,
Right.
there's an enormous imbalance there. So that's
Absolutely.
number one on that. That's, I think, deals with the individual, the need to be in a serving capacity.
Right.
I learned something from this personally, Sarah. I
Yes.
think you knew this. I was emceeing at a wedding back in, whatever was it, October. And it was interesting that somewhere in the course of the dinner or before the dinner, something got out of hand. I can't remember what it was now, but you know how you have the lineup for people to get their dinner?
Yes.
Well, for some reason, there was some logjam there. And it didn't take any smarts to figure it out. Jeremy gets there and gets behind the counter and starts, you know, serving plates and potatoes and whatever else it was. I'm doing all that stuff. And what was fascinating to me was, and that was, I mean, it was a fun thing to do and, all the stuff. But two things came out of that. Number one, it was an opportunity for me to meet everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Because you wouldn't normally at a wedding of 200 people, you're not going to meet everybody.
Usually stick at your table and maybe
Exactly.
a couple of other tables that you do know, yes.
This got me to meet everybody. And the other thing was, I found interesting, was the number of people who commented on it. Not in a sort of, upscale, downscale kind of way, but just commented on, hey, Jeremy, I saw you were behind the table doing it. You should do that more often. Or, ha, ha,
Right.
ha. But what I'm getting at is the concept of serving is exciting, it's motivating, it connects you with people, and
You
it's
say
well,
engagement.
and it's,
right.
and, yeah, exactly. And it's well liked.
Mm-hmm.
People like it. So, I mean, I think all I'm doing here is, and I think we are doing, is probably sort of regaling to a prospective politician, this is how you ought to go. The trouble is, the politician, that goes back to your point, is so often gauging the power that that person will achieve.
Mm-hmm. Blinders.
Yeah,
blinders on, right?
exactly. So I think there is an intrinsic problem that is probably tribal in nature. And I think it does lead to this point that if in fact I talk to 100 people or you talk to 100 people and we find that people are not what I call following the lead,
right?
What you may then say to yourself is, what arrangements do you need that will bring people in to heal? That will bring the leader into that arrangement that they will actually accommodate. They will, in fact, be servers.
So on that, sort of flowing from that, what role do you see or could Respectonomics play in reshaping the culture within these structures?
I think you've had the same experience that whenever we talk to people about Respectonomics, the one thing you and I have experienced is there is never any pushback.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it sounds like a big word. I think it is. I have not experienced any pushback. So I think one of the things we're doing is almost putting that old expression of putting the obvious in front of the obvious.
Right.
As my friend Bill Buxton said, that great line when he said, it's the art of making the obvious obvious before it becomes obvious. So in a sense, what we're doing is precisely that.
Right.
But it's a real soft underbelly.
Mm.
That's the biggest difficulty with this, what we're talking about.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that we know what we're saying is right. We know that it's right to be serving. We know that it's right for the leader to take the role of the servant leadership, if you will. We know that the leader should get away from this adversarial nonsense, should get away from gladiatorial fights. Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely obscene. Let's use Canadian politics. If you're not Canadian, listening to this might be a little difficult. But Canadian politics have become completely divisive. It's all to do with my way, the highway. Your way is wrong, and you're ugly. It's ridiculous.
Right.
Now, what I'm not sure of, and this is a chicken and egg story.
I was just going to say we're leading to the chicken and the egg here.
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether the divisiveness in that political arrangement is the result of or the cause of division in the country. Mm. I would like to think that the right answer, I think, is that we will always have divided opinions. We always will.
Absolutely.
And it's healthy. Yes. But ecologically speaking, we need to be different. That's very straightforward. But we need an arrangement that's going to bring us all together to have the mutual reciprocal benefits of that.
Well, and the respect.
And the respect.
And the respect in doing so, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what I call the soft underbelly, it's so difficult it's easy enough to articulate. It's to put it into practice, I think, is more difficult. And frankly, I go back to MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Yes, yeah.
I think what they did, I haven't got a clue what the sanctions are on drinking and driving. I have no idea. I know there's a policeman who will stop you and all that stuff. But I have no idea. MAD did a fantastic job of changing the culture. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to put it out to you to say this. if it's a cultural change that's needed, then that's a community responsibility. In other words, we need, as individuals, to demand of our people who are prospective leaders and so on, to say, you need to be serving. How are you going to do that?
Right. I really like that word culture. I like that word
I
culture.
really do.
Because it's so imperative in so many different dynamics and so many different groups.
Right.
Culture, your culture at home, your
Right.
culture in the community, your culture at an organization, your
Right.
culture in politics, right?
Yeah. And culture is,
It's so imperative to have that culture spot on.
yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, culture, as you know, I thought it was Peter Drucker who said it, but apparently it wasn't. But that, that great line, culture eats strategy before breakfast.
Mm,
In other words, culture really, really is important. So I
it
think
is
part of
foundation.
this, yeah, so part of what we're talking about is a clarion call to people to say to the people who want to be, whether they're council members, mayors, whatever,
Hmm.
provincial senators, those people need to be ready to answer one question: how are you going to serve? I
Wow.
always thought the right answer would be, if I were being elected, my answer would be that you have given me the power to vote for you,
Hmm.
because that's what matters. That's what
Right.
democracy is all about. See,
Yeah.
we said at the beginning of this chat, we talked about government and democracy and politics and all that. And democracy, again, back into the Greek, the power of the people. Well,
Right.
the power of the people has been lost. What you actually see in the political arrangements today, wherever you are, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, wherever you are, it's actually an ego, how do you say it? Egocracy. It's a power of my ego that matters.
Absolutely.
That
Like
is,
power. What
yeah,
power do I have? And power
yeah,
meaning control,
right. Yeah.
right?
So anyway, so I think we've probably beaten up on, unless do you have some other thoughts on that sort of the individual responsibility as a leader? Do you have, or the political?
No, I think we've covered that based
Okay.
on, yeah. Um, in what ways could respectonomics foster healthier relationships between leaders? So
Well,
looking at that within
yeah.
within the group, within that context.
Well, I think first of all, if you are a leader, jabbing and prodding and abusing other people is not the right way to bring people together. It is by definition divisive. It also happens to be offensive.
Right.
So,
Well, puts people on the defensive, puts their backs up.
well, okay, so once you're defensive, you have to have an offensive. Doesn't your
Right.
son tell you that in football?
Oh, I know offense and defense, hands
Yeah.
down.
So he'll tell you one needs the other, or one leads to the other, whichever you would say. But
Right.
no, I think the offensiveness that's going on in politics, it started off as a fairly sort of novel approach back in the 70s or 80s, I forget when.
Mhm.
And, it became very sort of spinning, and, people sort of saying, I can attack you on this and they'll attack you on that and blah, blah, blah. But attacking is in fact divisive. It's also, as any conservationist will tell you, anything that attacks one human being against another is an incredible waste of human talent.
Mm,
It's awful. I mean,
absolutely.
you only have to go to Ukraine today to see the appalling savagery and the waste of humanity. So this business of duking it out one with another is not a good idea, and it leads to division. And in fact, I think it crystallizes the person saying, "Okay, my faction's bigger than yours."
Yeah. It misses one key component
Yeah.
that I think is imperative, and that's collaboration.
Absolutely.
It's non-existent.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you 100% on that. And I think, therefore, one of the things that, and this is getting a little bit over the line, but here it is, that one of the problems with the political arrangement today, if you look at government, you look at parliament, you look at Senate, Congress, go around the world. But one of the things that's missing is the concept of governance. See,
Mm,
you come from a corporate background, I do too. And we
right.
were very aware of governance because governance was the mechanism by which people were held accountable.
Yes.
That accountability was recognized from the get go. And it was basically, if you do your job, you will be paid. And if you do not, you're out.
Right.
A little bit bluntly. But
Right.
if you look at for example, the CEO of an organization, that individual is the single employee of the board of directors. The
Right.
board of directors sets the policies and the broad brush direction for the company or the business, and the CEO is then empowered to do that, to execute it. The director, as you know, does not belong in the kitchen.
Right.
Not meant to be there.
Right.
So what we've got today is we've got cabinet ministers who are in the kitchen. We've got leaders who have no accountability. We know that. And we have a mechanism that doesn't even allow accountability to be enforced. I'll give you a very clear example. And that is, do you not find it extraordinary that you've got some kind of tin pot constitution in the Liberal Party that is holding the country to ransom? That isn't right.
No.
The fact of the matter is that the Prime Minister has lost his, what would you call it, his capital, his ethos, kudos, whatever word you want. And that's not an accusation. It's just, to everything there's a season.
Right.
And his season is over. And the system is unable to accommodate that. And in other words, you're taking a country of 40 million people that are effectively being held ransom by a sort of political arrangement that says, oh, well, the only way we can get rid of him is if we have this number of people in caucus. And you know what? Right. Most of us don't even know what we're talking about. That's how, beyond the natural it has gone. And I think that what I'm talking about here is the physical arrangement of governing.
Right.
It's one of the biggest risks to the process. So you have somebody, how many times have you found somebody in your life who's gone into politics, frankly, with all the right credentials? They believe in themselves, they believe in the people, they believe in serving. They're wonderful people. I'm not questioning that.
Right.
And they've got a great sense of duty to what I call God, King, and country. They've got it all together.
Right.
How come they get so marginalized? How come they get so tainted? Because you've seen those
the framework, their parameters that they have to work within, they're restricted by.
Exactly.
Or need to model or follow, right?
I mean, you come from a human resource background, and I'll let you talk about this better than I can, but I think you'll say that the framework that an employee or an employer is operating within has a great deal of influence on their behavior.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There is where I see the problem.
Again, foundation.
And I'll give you one example of where this really comes to the table, and that is that the concept of being in Parliament with all the bells and whistles and everything, it's in fact illogical to have party politics. Party politics is like having two lobbying groups that just throw snowballs at each other. That is not, have you ever listened to the question period and you see these people ranting and raving at each other as though somehow that benefits the country?
Right.
As somehow that's a concept of serving. Can you imagine going to a restaurant, a really nice restaurant, by the way? You and I have been to one of them.
Yes.
What was it called? Scaramouche? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And did you notice one thing? The servers all work together.
Yes.
The maitre d', the fellow who was coming and doing, clearing plates or whatever it was, they all work together. Can you imagine how long you would stay in that restaurant if the servers started throwing bombs at each other?
Well, maybe for a minute, just to watch.
Well, exactly.
Outside of that, again, it boils down to collaboration.
Absolutely.
And the culture that you've created for that environment, right?
Yeah. The serving example, it has one other interesting thing, and that is, I did actually notice that evening when we were with your family. And what I noticed was that another server would come up who had nothing really to do with the table responsibly, but would come up and say, have you got everything you need?
Yes.
Can you imagine in the House of Commons if somebody from the other side, as it were? But you see, the thing is, there is no side in that restaurant, and there shouldn't be sides.
Right.
That should be the collective body that represents the interests of Canadians. And I'm not being idealistic. This business of the party has contaminated and created this toxic atmosphere where power becomes the be-all and the end-all. And
Right.
then you're putting it escalates to where you get cabinet authority and cabinet, what do they call it? The rights of making rules or something without going to
Right.
vote.
Right.
I can't remember all the details. But this is game. How many people know the rules of engagement on this? Very few people really know it.
Right.
They trot out these lines like, "Oh, we have a system that works." Well, actually, I think this is Edward de Bono. I don't know if you've read any of his work, but he was the one who had written extensively on lateral thinking.
Mm, okay.
Yeah. And one of his great examples is you're asked to dig a hole. So you dig this hole, and it is the most beautiful hole that's ever been dug on this planet. It is cylindrical, it's smooth, the top is properly, grooved, and it contours with the surrounding land. I mean, it is the beauty of holes. There's only one problem. The hole is in the wrong place. And that pretty much sums up that you put me into that political cauldron
Right.
in the wrong place. Because the things that we're talking about, this dignity, the respect, the trust, the confidence, the transparency. I mean, these are all words. And the trouble is, you've seen enough people standing up to lead who give you all of this lip service. They say, you can trust me. Anything we do will be transparent. Well, in the last 10 years, the one thing you can be absolutely certain of is that transparency went down the tubes.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the darkest places it's ever been.
Yeah.
So going back to I think the origin of your question. So I don't want to dominate this conversation.
No, that's okay.
But I think going back to the beginnings of time, the concept of dignifying another human being, I think we all agree that is fundamental to the growth and the preservation of what Canada's all about, or any country. We shouldn't even isolate that to Canada.
No, for sure. It's definitely
so if we're going to reinforce that dignity, then I think it's incumbent on the leadership to express how they see that dignity not only being put in place and being applied, but how do they ensure that they're being held to the wire? Because if you think, sorry,
go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say that's a great segue to in terms of managing expectations, right? So how can Respectonomics help in terms of managing the relational expectations in such a divided environment?
Well, I think this goes back to how Respectonomics really came into being in the first place, and that is that this division you're talking about in some ways reflects the division that's within somebody's life. Right. If you talk to people today, you will find their heads are divided, their lives are divided, their demands on their lives are divided, and Respectonomics has always been, or wants to be, an avenue or conduit to bringing people back to themselves, to be able to harmonize themselves in terms of what they are. This concept of the body and the mind and the soul, and giving the individual the right to exercise each of those. Because when you start exercising the right to be the individual, that is when you can shout out, I am Sarah, I am Jeremy. Because until we actually get into that basis of saying, I am, I think the biggest risk is the leadership will always say, you are.
Agreed.
So I think that to me is the key point, giving people the right to be themselves. I think the structures, the political, I keep calling them that, the governmental structures, I think are in the wrong place. Frankly, I think you would say to me, well, Jeremy, that's outside our orbit. I think it probably is. But the dignity concept must be the denominator to that entire arrangement.
You say that it may be out of our orbit. However, when it comes to Respectonomics, and you and I have talked actually about this word on many occasions, use the word conduit, right? I do really feel that Respectonomics is the conduit that can help bridge gaps, right, and help connect and collaborate and reset cultures, reset thought process and thinking, and help navigate how we manage things.
And I would go with you on that and say it also helps to reimagine our expectations. I mean, the trouble with expectations today is they tend to be, I mean, quite frankly, they tend to be rather shallow. They tend to be, I want more money for less work. I mean, that's
Right.
almost the starting gate in most New Year's resolutions. That's what you sort of hear that sense. And the answer is that if we, in fact, create this inner collaboration of oneself, then we are in a position to collaborate with other people. And when we collaborate with other people, a lot of these governmental toxicities and whatever, they will just disappear.
Mm-hmm. And collaborate with respect.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And dignity and, you know, I think a little bit of interest in other people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one thing, I don't know about you, I have never, ever been thanked by a politician.
I can't say that I've ever been thanked by a politician.
No, I just think it's extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you think of the places you've been in your life where somebody says, you know, well, it was at the Lion King on Saturday. I mean, there you have a sort of Disney production, absolutely, you know, a commercial. It's brilliant, it's wonderful. And what I found interesting was a lady, as I was leaving, she was holding some brochures or something and said, I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for coming. Well, naturally, I turned to her and said it was actually the other way around. Thank you. But that concept, I mean, seriously, I mean, you see the politician standing up on the podium. You've seen this 100 times. And the individual says, I want to thank you for being here today. Translation, I want your vote.
Right.
It's not a sincerity of thanks and gratitude and appreciation.
I think if that thank you comes in other opportunities or other circumstances or other times, and it's a continuum versus
Yep.
a one-shot thing, it has a different connotation to it and a different feeling and a different vibe for people, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and I think again, I mean, the problem we keep coming back to is what a politician should or could be doing versus the system encouraging it.
Right.
And I think that system's encouragement has to come from the grassroots.
Just one last thought on that in terms of the chicken and the egg.
Mm.
Does that politician behave in that manner because they have to? Right? Or is it a choice? Like you say, chicken and egg.
I think your have to comment is very appropriate. I think the difficulty is that party politics alone says this is the answer to that question.
Right.
Well, no. The answer to the question is what from your heart do you think is the right way to handle? If you don't have the answer, say so.
Right.
You know, from a human resource point of view, there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't have an answer, I'll have to get back to you.
For me, I think personally that was always the most intelligent answer. If you truly don't know, there's credibility and respect in saying, you know what, I don't have all the details on that. Let me go and investigate and let me get back to you. And then the key is the follow-up, get back to.
Okay, so we're going to throw the gauntlet down to our audience.
Yes.
We want to hear from them, from people, how they believe that the system, the process can be brought into this line of dignity and respect. We need help. It's not, you and I can't do it, but we can do one thing, and that is to thank people for listening and thank people for being able to come to the table with new ideas.
They are certainly welcome.
Definitely.
Perfect. Well, it was lovely chatting with you again, Jeremy. Interesting topic, which I think we could talk about for hours on end. However, great conversation.
I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Bye, sir.
Bye now.